Now, I'll be honest, as a Christian who's been in many different churches over the years, a lot of times out of necessity and because we're trying to reach people that are seeking, or they're young Christians or whatever, we spend a lot of time in the New Testament of the Bible. A lot of Christians think the Old Testament is full of God's judgment and wrath and that sort of thing. Unfortunately, we're kind of ripping ourselves off. We are missing some things in the Old Testament that are absolutely amazing. From a mathematical and statistical standpoint, there's things in there that make the hair stand up on the back of my neck. Now here's one of them. Jesus is our high priest. And when Jesus died, he was the sacrifice. He was not only our high priest, but he was also our Passover lamb. He was the sacrifice that would take away our sins, and he's the way to the Father. So back again in the law, we're going back to 1500 BC with Moses. In the book of Numbers, chapter 35, God set up these things called cities of refuge. And what happened was, back in the day, it was an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. If you had two families and they necessarily didn't get along, and somebody killed a member of the other family, if they felt like it was accidental, they would run for their lives to a city of refuge. If they made it to the city before they caught him and put him to death, because if they caught him and put him to death, it was all done and over with, it's okay. But if he made it into the city, he would go to the altar and he would grab onto the horns of the altar and he would plead for amnesty. And the high priest would come out and they would have basically a trial. And they would listen to evidence presented from the family of the accused and from the family whose member was killed. And in the end, they would decide if this was not an accidental death, if it was premeditated in any way, it was murder, they would hand the individual over to the family of the deceased and they would put them to death. It was an eye for an eye, a life for a life. But if they believed that the death was accidental, then the individual would be allowed to eventually have amnesty and leave the city. But they had to stay in the city of refuge until something very important happened. If they ever ventured in the next months outside the city limits and members of the other family found the individual, they had the right to put him to death. So this person was basically held in the city of refuge until a certain thing happened that forgave them for the sin and allowed them to go free. And we should ask a very important question. So what was that thing? What thing had to happen that would finally allow this person to be forgiven from the act of killing the other individual? And the answer is the death of the high priest. So once the high priest died, the person's sin was forgiven, they went back home, and all was forgiven. Nobody could take retribution on them. So once again, this isn't just a sign of Jesus, our high priest, who died for our sins, and by his death, our high priest's death, we're set free. It was more than just that. This is Jewish tradition, this is Jewish law. This is something that God told society, the Jewish society, to put into place. And so it's pretty impressive that, again, out of the Jewish religion comes all these prophecies and signs of the Messiah. And this one, again, 1,500 years before Jesus comes along, is a clear depiction of the fact that the Messiah, our high priest, would have to die for our atonement.